All right. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our Stakeholder Engagement virtual event, a core element of the Sustainability Toolkit. We are so happy to have you with us. This event is organized by BCSD Malaysia and supported by our global network partner, the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, WBCSD. Allow me to introduce BCSD Malaysia before we begin. The Business Council for Sustainable Development is a CEO-led, action-oriented collaboration and advocacy platform. We convene members and stakeholders in a safe, pre-competitive, collaborative space to develop tools, methodologies, and to share best practice. We help embed sustainability into core business strategy and operations to create a competitive advantage for our members. On top of that, we also raise awareness, share knowledge, and build capacity. We advocate the case for sustainability as a business opportunity, engage with policymakers and regulation authorities, and lastly, initiate projects and programs in collaboration with stakeholders both in Malaysia and Southeast Asia. I would like to kindly inform everyone that this session is being recorded and all audiences will be kept on mute. Questions can be asked during the Q&A session, where you can either unmute and speak or choose to write the question in the chat box. We are discussing stakeholder engagement today because it is crucial to the success of any organization. Stakeholder engagement is a process by which companies communicate and get to know their stakeholders. By getting to know their stakeholders, companies are able to better understand what they want, when they want it, how engaged they are, and how the company's plans and actions will affect them. This is simply because business is all about relationships, whether you're a startup or a large business, a government, or an NGO. Essentially, the success or failure of any policy, product, or service starts and ends with stakeholders. Ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to introduce to you our first speaker, Andy Beanland, who is a director with the Redefining Value team at WBCSD based in Geneva. He leads the Redefining Value project on embedding ESG in decision-making, which focuses on supporting food retail companies in integrating ESG into risk management, corporate governance, performance management, and internal controls. His extensive experience includes working in the sustainable tourism and sustainable mobility sectors. He is also a fellow of the Winston Churchill Memorial Trust and runs Resilience Permaculture, a permaculture-inspired small farm in the French Pyrenees, offering design services to individuals and organizations. Mr. Andy is now going to give a presentation on stakeholder engagement in materiality assessment. Thank you so much for joining us today, Andy, and the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you for that very kind introduction, and thank you, Roberto, Savita, and the BCSD Malaysia team for inviting me to speak at this session today. Really interested to share a few insights and hopefully have a good discussion about the kind of role of stakeholders in sustainability throughout this webinar. I'm just going to try and move my slides forward, so just see if that works. Looks like it is. Great. So I'm going to start by giving a very quick introduction to WBCSD for those of you who aren't familiar with us. I'm then going to explain a little bit about our Reporting Matters project, and then touch on 3 or 4 examples of practice of stakeholder engagement in the materiality assessment process that we've seen with the members that we work with. Many of you will know the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. We're a CEO-led organization with about 200 global members. And we have about 60 national business councils, including obviously BCSD Malaysia. And really we're aligned behind a vision of a world that by 2050, in which 9 billion people are living well within planetary boundaries. And our focus very much is, driving and accelerating the transition towards that world by making a more sustainable business more successful. Our work is really structured around three focus areas. The first one is around the imperatives that all businesses globally must work on. This is around implementing really ambitious strategies and actions around driving towards net zero, so action on climate. It's around being nature positive and tackling the issues around biodiversity loss and nature loss. And the third part is around contributing to equitable societies. We also work across a number of pathways. So these are the kind of the value chains that companies operate in that are really going to drive the transformations we need to get to a world in where 9 billion people are living well within planetary boundaries. Think about things like the food and agriculture, mobility, built environment, energy, products and materials, and health and well-being. Those are the pathways that we're working on. And then the final piece is really around redefining value. And this is really looking at how companies engage with the capital markets and how the capital markets can accelerate transformation. And what we're doing is really we're calling on business to recognize the need to reinvent capitalism, the fact that the existing model of capitalism isn't appropriate or supporting the transitions we need to get to that sort of vision 2050. We need to move towards true value creation, building long-term resilience, taking a regenerative approach, going beyond no harm, and that the model of the economic model that we need to strive towards is one that is stakeholder oriented rather than just shareholder oriented. It really needs to think about and bring in impact internalizing rather than impact externalizing, as we see at the moment. And it needs to be much more long-term focused rather than for short-term profit and gain. And ultimately, we need to progress to a situation where companies and society is regenerative rather than degenerative, and that it's accountable rather than unaccountable as well. So these are the sort of three focus areas that we're working on at WBCSD. And we're bringing all this together to tackle some of the pressing challenges that companies are working on. So, we know that decarbonising is a major priority. How to become nature positive is also a significant area of focus. But one of the real challenging areas that we see and areas for action for our members is how to explain the actions that they are taking to their stakeholders and how they're going to contribute to this broader vision, and we think that's a super important element. So we have a strong focus on ensuring that members are communicating effectively to their stakeholders why they're taking certain actions to drive that sustainability agenda forward. Which brings me to our Reporting Matters project. So Reporting Matters was established in 2013. To really evaluate the effectiveness of WBCSD members' sustainability reports. And through this project, we do several things. We review about 170 of our members' sustainability reports every year. We use a holistic framework, which I'll touch on shortly, to provide direct, personalized and confidential feedback to members on the things that they can do in their external disclosures to be more effective particularly around how they engage with stakeholders. And then the second sort of part of that project is we produce an annual report, which has many examples of good practice and picks up on trends and themes in the sustainability reporting space each year. So there's a whole back catalogue of 10 years worth of examples and good practice that you can go and draw on and see how WBCSD members are disclosing their engagements with stakeholders. So I would definitely encourage you to go and have a look at that as kind of a follow-up from this session, because some really good examples in there that you can take away as practical stuff. And I'm going to pick out a few from that are going to be included in this year's report as a sneak preview in the next couple of minutes. So when we do these assessments of our members' sustainability reports, we really take a holistic view to how they're disclosing, because we think that the ESG sustainability disclosure really needs to consider a range of audience needs. There are many stakeholders who are looking to company sustainability reports to understand how companies are progressing on their sustainability ambitions, but also how they're contributing to the broader sort of globally agreed sustainability goals, obviously such as the Paris Agreement and the SDGs. So we have 18 indicators with our framework. They're grouped into key reporting principles, and those of which you're familiar with, things like GRI or even financial reporting standards, will recognise some of these key principles that we look at. The reporting content, so what the different components of the report that they include, and then finally the report experience, because even the most technical of stakeholder needs to be able to kind of understand and navigate the information that's being presented in the report. Now, there's two of these criteria that we really consider as kind of fundamental, and without getting these two criteria right, it's very difficult for our members to score well on this criteria, and those are materiality and stakeholder engagement. And essentially, the way our assessment works is that if the other components of content and experience are really related to the quality of companies' disclosures around materiality and stakeholder engagement. And I'll just explain a little bit about what they each pick up, so you can understand maybe some practical tips that you can take away for your own reporting in future years. So on the materiality criteria, this is really about looking at the materiality process and identifying, prioritizing the significant ESG impacts, both the risks and opportunities which impact the organization. Oh, I think I just lost control of the slides. Just going to go back one. Oh, take control. Back.
Do you want to take control? Yeah.
Yeah, it just stopped taking control. Yeah, so where was I? So yeah, the materiality process is really about prioritizing the significant ESG impacts and thinking about the risks and opportunities that impact the organization. But a key component of that is including how the companies are taking into account the perspective of the organization, but also key stakeholders. And what we're really looking for is, disclosure around the kind of the relative importance of the issues that are important to stakeholders and how that prioritization process took place. So we're looking, as we're making this assessment of how sort of complete and effective the disclosure is. We're looking to see, how are they doing this around how are they engaging with stakeholders? What is the process they've been through? What were the outcomes? How did they prioritize them? So that's a really cool fundamental piece of the materiality assessment that we look for. And then this sort of the stakeholder engagement criteria, again, this is looking for a clear and transparent disclosure around how there's an open dialogue with the key groups or people that really are impacted or influenced by the organization and its activities, both obviously now but also in the future. So we look to see, is there some element of that the main stakeholder groups have been identified and organised and engaged, and how they articulated in the report. What are the kind of formal mechanisms that the company puts in place to engage with those stakeholder groups, and really how do they consider the needs of the stakeholder groups and provide that evidence that they really have been through a thorough and complete stakeholder engagement process. So those are the kind of two criteria we look at. Now, I've got 3 examples that I'd want to share in the next couple of minutes. This is from Petronas, obviously a Malaysian oil and gas company, pretty well known to everyone here. And this is an example from their integrated report from 2021. And actually, this is where they talk about their materiality assessment process and how they get down to the topics that they've determined to be material for their organisation. And they go through 4 steps to do that. They talk about the identification, they talk about stakeholder engagement, prioritization, and endorsement and approval. There's a really good, concise narrative on that materiality assessment process. And in step 2, they talk about how they've engaged with stakeholders, such as media, communities, and government, and so on. Now, we think that this is a really interesting example because they talk about the process really well, but there could be more detail on how stakeholders are engaged, and because it's clear that they have been engaged, but that the extent of which that engagement taken place, we think could be enhanced. But it's still, nevertheless, it's a good step in the right direction, and we think, definitely the recommendations here would be that, to continue develop this this year on year, because when you look at another part of the integrated report from Petronas in 2021, they have an excellent section on how they engage stakeholders. So there's a slight disconnect between the materiality part and this engaging with stakeholders section of the report. They really can articulate elements of the quality engagement. I've not seen this in very many reports that we've looked at, how frequently the engagement is, and how the engagement connects into the material topics. So there's some really interesting examples here of things that you could take away and consider in your own materiality assessment process, how you articulate your own engagement with stakeholders. This sort of second example I wanted to share, and really to contrast, is from Stora Enso. So Stora Enso is a integrated paper and packaging company based in Finland. They're a long-term high performer in our reporting matters assessments. Have been certainly within the top 10 WBCSD members for a number of years on that assessment. And they produce a sort of separate materiality assessment document that complements their annual integrated report. So what they do is they set out the process for the materiality assessment really clearly. But I think what's really interesting about this particular example is that they acknowledge the double materiality perspective in their materiality assessment. So that's basically saying that they're considering the impacts of the company on their stakeholders and the environment and society, as well as the financial materiality of these issues that they're considering to be the most material. And they, in the table that I've sort of put the box around, they talk about how those different stakeholders are engaged, the information and sources they might have used through the engagement process, the time period when that engagement took place, and their approach to responding to any issues or topics raised through that stakeholder engagement process. So again, an interesting example that you can potentially draw on. And then perhaps my final example of good practice is one from OCP Group. They're one of the world leaders of market phosphate and its derivatives. And in their annual integrated report, they've got a methodological notes section where they explain the process of engagement with relevant stakeholders and experts. Now, I think the bit that's really interesting in this is they've got an interesting temporal element to the disclosure. So they are showing how their relationships with stakeholders have evolved over time, and how they've involved their engagement with the materiality assessment process over time. So that's something I've not seen very often, but I think it's a really interesting approach to show that kind of evolution. And then the second component here is they talk about how stakeholders are positioned relative to their sphere of influence, which is an interesting way of considering that. But what we don't know from this disclosure is if or how stakeholder views were weighted or prioritized as they were doing the prioritization of ESG issues. So there's some really good examples here. There's lots of areas for improvement as well, and I wouldn't say that any of these examples are perfect, but snippets of them should give you food for thought on how you can bring your stakeholder engagement activities into your external disclosures. Yeah, I know we're going to get much more into this topic through the rest of the webinar. I'll just wrap up by saying that if you'd like to find out more about reporting matters, we've obviously got a lot of content on WBCSD website, but also that I know we've worked very closely with our colleagues here at BCSD Malaysia to work with them to develop a service that they're currently offering to all their members on doing the same sort of approach, this very detailed, this very analytical, this very holistic approach to improving the effectiveness of sustainability reporting. So I think Roberto and Savita, if I'm sure if you want your members to get in touch and find out how they can participate in that project with you. So I'll pause there and hand it back to Savita to continue the webinar, and look forward to continuing the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrew. Thank you for the insightful discussion. And I'm sure our attendees have questions that they can address to you during the panel discussion. Yeah? Thank you. Our next speaker is Ms. Stephanie Broekman, who is the General Manager of SPRG and also the Director of BCSD Malaysia. She is an expert in transforming corporate reputation through brand building, high-level stakeholder engagement, and community outreach. She possesses extensive experience working with public and private organizations and firms of all sizes and stages of growth. Her immense work experience includes senior positions in leading local and international PR consultancies based in London, Singapore, and Malaysia. In addition to this, she had worked as a business consultant for German companies entering Asia through the German Chamber of Commerce and Industry Network. Ms. Stephanie will be speaking about the 5-step approach to stakeholder engagement. Thank you so much for joining us, Stephanie, and over to you.
Yeah, can everyone hear me? Yeah, my mic is open. Hello, good afternoon. Thanks so much, Savita, for the introduction. I have already tried to take control. Do I have control? Just check.
I think we do.
Yes, okay. Yes, good afternoon, everyone. I'm really glad to be here with you today, and I'm going to share something very, very practical. It's actually a tool, the how can you go about stakeholder engagement, and I'm going to use a 5-step approach that was developed by BSR, which is a non-profit organization, which describes itself as Sustainable Business Network and consultancy focused on creating a world in which all people can thrive on a healthy planet. And the organization makes a lot of their reports and their work available for everyone. So if you are just in the beginning of your activities and stakeholder engagement, please do have a look. But you will also get these slides afterwards. I saw that somebody already had that question. So if any of the details if I can't go into any of the details here because of the shortness of time, please just bear with it. You will be able to read up on it later. So BCR's 5-step approach is a very practical methodology and guide that shows companies how they can build and sustain constructive relationships over time, and how they can create sustained value while doing so. This is done by engaging early and often, and by acting upon the insights gathered. But first, let's look at why we need stakeholder engagement. Give me a second. I do have a problem with my navigation here. Actually, I'm still controlling, right? Because it doesn't. I'm still controlling, Savita?
I think you are. Can you see your notes?
Yeah, no, yeah, but I couldn't scroll my notes just now. So now it's working again.
Right.
Please forgive me. I start again. Please let's look first at why we need stakeholder engagement. As pointed out by Andrew earlier, companies need to understand and manage their relevant stakeholders in order to be able to create long-term value, ensure resilience, and contribute to the global sustainability goals. Taking the needs of all your stakeholders into account and engaging with them to identify those needs and determine actions to meet those needs is a vital and strategic element in securing the long-term business success of any organization. Now, if we agree that organizations need strategies to understand and respond to existing and emerging societal concerns, It is also clear that they need input from key stakeholder groups to formulate those strategies. They won't have all this knowledge and information in their own company. In today's shifting business environment, where social and environmental concerns are increasingly prominent, companies also need a robust approach, and they need effective tools to deal with the rising expectations and the trust deficits that we see affecting relationships between many companies and their stakeholders. Who is a stakeholder? A stakeholder is someone who affects or is affected by your company's products or activities. Stakeholders, as you probably know, can be either within or outside your organization. Some key groups of stakeholders include employees, customers, suppliers, investors, non-profit partners, and the communities that are impacted by your operations. As you will see in a bit, when we go through the various steps of the engagement process, your stakeholder landscape is specific to you and your organization. And you should spend some time identifying your stakeholders in more detail. Some of you might ask, is such a thorough process really necessary, or can I perhaps engage somebody who does that for me? Maybe you think your organization isn't that big or significant, or maybe you're not a public listed company and you don't have the same disclosure obligations. Or maybe you're still in the startup phase and not ready for this strategic exercise. Well, I think stakeholder engagement is something all companies should take on board and use to their benefit. If you think about it, the stakes at play today are very high. Companies are under increasing reputational pressure and know they must act, and that stakeholder engagement is essential. However, they often engage without clear understanding of the right method or channel and without clear intent. Other mistakes include that they're not related to their core business activity, or some leave it entirely up to their communications team to handle stakeholder matters. Or they only engage with those stakeholders that they are already familiar with, or those that shout the loudest. And one big mistake is that often companies don't spend time building internal awareness and internal capacity for stakeholder engagement. And then they try to go about it without having the buy-in of their colleagues. So this 5-step approach provides you with a very comprehensive toolkit that you can go through step by step to develop and execute an effective stakeholder engagement strategy and action plan. But there is a step 0 before you can start. You need to build a baseline understanding inside your organization. And let me read this quote to you. What is needed here is really a shift of mindset. You need to, just give me a second. Again, it's not scrolling. You need to understand that true stakeholder engagement is not about reputation management. It requires a mindset shift within your organization, and you must stop looking at stakeholders' concerns only as external risks that need to be managed. And you should start treating them as serious topics that merit transparent dialogue and a strategic response. So let's look at the step 1 of this process, which is developing your engagement strategy. And to make a business case for it. Effective stakeholder engagement is like a savings fund. It grows over time and shields you in time of crisis. In times of, it can be fiscal distress, reputational crisis. Anyway, you build the trust through your engagement, and then you will benefit from it if you need to. In addition to shielding you, a higher awareness of stakeholder interests allows you to avoid crises altogether in some cases, because you will be better able to anticipate risks and opportunities. There are a number of compelling studies across industries and countries that concluded that companies that intentionally build stakeholder trust benefit across multiple value indicators, such as financial resilience, valuation, return on equity, or even cost reduction. If you look at financial resilience, for example, there's a lot of evidence that companies that showed very good ESG performance and listened to their stakeholders and also talked to them throughout the COVID pandemic came out of the crisis much faster and in a better financial position than their competitors who didn't do that. So the engagement strategy development is all about finding your purpose and building a strategic vision for your stakeholder engagement. And there's three things you should do here. First of all, look at the history of your engagement so that you can use the insights that you gain from there to inform your current strategy. Ask yourself, what did I do previously? Did it work? What was the reason I engaged before? And did my engagement really address salient concerns? The second step is to understand the motivation behind the engagement. Setting a vision will clarify specific objectives you're trying to achieve in business and in sustainability. Nowadays, companies find it increasingly difficult to respond to the urgency and the scale of changes in the external environment. To deal with systemic issues such as climate change, discrimination, or corruption, it's really important to broaden your focus of stakeholder engagement from reputation building and risk management to include partnership and collaboration. Next, determine who has a stake and define the boundaries of your stakeholder landscape. It's also worth noting that not all engagements require a full engagement process. Some specific time-bound projects, for instance, you just want to gather feedback for your new reporting format. For those projects, it is enough if you just reach out to a targeted set of stakeholders once, seek their feedback, and be done with it. But for the full process, you need to engage in step 2 of our process here, which is stakeholder mapping. Now, what is this exactly? It's a collaborative process of research, analysis, debate, and discussion that draws from multiple perspectives to determine a key list of stakeholders across the entire stakeholder spectrum. It's an important step to understand who your stakeholders are, what their relationship is to your business, and how they are impacted by it. The mapping can be broken down into 4 phases. First, you need to identify your stakeholders. Then you need to analyze and rank them according to their relevance. The actual building of the map is a visualization of the relationships to objectives and to other stakeholders. And finally, you need to select your engagement approach. This process of stakeholder mapping is no less important than the result. It depends heavily on the chosen approaches and the people participating in it. So let's start with identifying your stakeholders. How do you get started on this part? I suggest you start by brainstorming without screening. Include everyone who has an interest in your objectives today and who may have one tomorrow. And wherever possible, identify individuals and not just organizations. Now, here's a couple of the typical stakeholder groups and how they can be broken down further. So we have owners, customers, employees, industry, community, environment, government, civil society organizations. You really have to work through your own list according to your own scenario. But please be aware, there is no magic list of stakeholders. The final list will be yours and yours only. It depends on your business, its impacts, and your strategic vision. The list should also be dynamic and change over time. As the external environment evolves and as stakeholders themselves make decisions, shift focus, or even change their opinions and positions. There are some other key considerations to help you build your stakeholder landscape. Try to learn from your past as well as current engagements. Ask yourself and document which stakeholders communicate regularly with your company. Is there an opportunity or is there a pressing need to engage with lesser known stakeholders? Also, consider the future and look beyond the usual suspects. Consider how you can assess potential stakeholders from new markets, new technologies, and new interest groups. Try to ensure diversity in your stakeholder engagement. Stakeholders should embody a good mix, and the full spectrum of expertise, attitudes, geographies, and try to include influencers, collaborators, advocates, critics, and implementation partners. You see, this is a wide open process. Use technology tools. Analyze social media to detect trends and spot shifts in public opinion. And consider your impact, but don't prioritize noisy critics over genuine experts. We all tend to do that because those noisy critics are in our ears and in our face most of the time. Step back and consider who is most impacted by your operations and decisions. As mentioned before, traditionally, stakeholder engagement has been seen as a way to determine the level of risk posed to the business by stakeholders. Today, the more pressing question is on the impact a business has on the stakeholder. So after you have identified the stakeholders, you need to analyze them based on the following criteria. And there's, I believe, 6. There's influence, there's expertise, there's orientation, there's vulnerability, there's capacity, and there is trust. Not all criteria are relevant for each engagement, and using a maximum of 4 is recommended. It's just impossible to analyze each stakeholder and apply all criteria. It will be much too complex. Once you have done that, you actually select from these criteria and you can populate a chart, and you can use those descriptions according to how you think stakeholders fulfill them, and then assign a value. You can use low, medium, or high to the various stakeholders. This will help you later decide which stakeholders to engage and how. And make sure that your criteria match your engagement strategy. For a materiality assessment, for example, suitable criteria would be expertise, influence, and orientation. For projects with negative human rights impact, you should focus on vulnerability and orientation, and so forth. The mapping process generates a visual analysis that you can use to further determine which stakeholders to engage with and which approach to use. Mapping allows you to evaluate stakeholders by using consistent criteria and helps you visualize the often very complex interplay of issues and relationships created. And now we come to the engagement approach. After you have identified the stakeholders and analyzed them and also prioritized them, ranked them, you now need to decide how you want to engage with them. And it is, of course, not practical to engage all stakeholder groups with the same level of intensity using the same approach. It is important to be highly selective also in choosing stakeholders for ongoing consultation and collaboration. Being strategic and clear about who you are engaging with and why can help you save time and money, but more importantly, it will help you manage expectations. So I can't go into every approach here in detail, given the time, but don't worry. Once you get these slides, you can look at it and you can always approach me with any questions you may have afterwards. Let me just highlight that these engagement approaches mentioned here are different degrees of intensity and of direct contact, starting with monitoring. For some issues, it is enough to track stakeholder positions via research or via talking to others, and track, for example, sustainability issues that are of the greatest concerns to your stakeholders, and use that for your materiality process. You can also see messaging as one of your engagement approaches. You can create and target messages to specific stakeholders. For example, identify new issue areas that require positioning or disclosure. And at the most intensive end of this options is innovate. This means you work together with stakeholders on common objectives. This can even include co-creation of new ideas, like the launch of a new service or product in partnership with an expert stakeholder. The steps 3 and 4 of the process that I am talking about here are the very, very pragmatic steps: preparation and the actual principles that you need to apply for engagement. And that's why I have combined them here in my slides. It's about long-term goals to drive the approach, determine logistics for the engagement, set the rules, and then following the core principles and ensuring equitable stakeholder contributions. There are several core principles that should govern every engagement. It should be focused and timely, and it should be inclusive and respectful, and it should be candid. Candidness is very important because you need to make sure that you are seen as transparent, and therefore all your engagement notes, actions, and outcomes should always be shared with everyone. I'm going to give you a few more considerations here. This is for in-person engagement. There are several considerations that you should have: familiarity, frequency, guidance, facilitation, participant profile, complexity, and trust and credibility. I just want to highlight here, in some cases, it's very good if you choose to have facilitation for your engagement instead of engaging directly, because this can be seen as more neutral, can help avoid conflict, specifically for controversial issues. It's also important that you consider before the engagement whether you are engaging with one person or with a whole organization or with many representatives from different organizations. And of course, you have to structure your engagement accordingly. For effective engagement, there are many other things you need to consider. Things like authority, formality, atmosphere, facilitation, and participation. These are more psychological considerations. For example, the dynamics of the stakeholders in the room can greatly influence the outcome or how a discussion goes. Even the atmosphere that you create with the venue where you hold a meeting, for example, or how formal you want to be about the engagement can influence. So these are all things worth considering before an engagement. And once you are at that level, you are ready for your action plan. Step number 5. This is where your commitment to engage genuinely and effectively is actually put to the test. The action plan you need to develop here must have the clear objective to translate the findings and insights gathered and the agreements made during engagements into deeds. Once you have determined your plan, you need to communicate these actions to your stakeholders. This applies to each engagement. If you have ongoing, repeated interactions with stakeholder groups, the action plan from one engagement should directly inform the planning and execution of the next, like a work in progress documentation. And you can build trust and understanding as you iterate this process. Begin by creating a clear action plan with distinctly separate consideration of next steps and outcomes for both external and internal stakeholders. This helps you target your messages to specific audiences, and it also keeps your document clean. It could become very cluttered very easily if you try to combine everything in one document. As example, for external actions, for the external, as example for next steps for external actions, you could think of relationship building, future engagements, listing concrete actions you're planning to take as a result of the engagement, and so forth. For internal actions, this could be improving processes, revising strategies, build capacity for the next engagement. Next, create an overview. Refer back to your written engagement notes and consider the entire range of issues that came up during engagement, especially if your response is take no action. Difference of opinion and priorities among participants is inevitable, so you must prepare a rationale for your response to each issue. Then, build a plan. For each potential next step, consider the concerns and perceptions stakeholders expressed during the engagement, as well as the key discussion points. Each action should include roles and responsibilities for implementation, as well as a realistic timeline. Think back to your original objectives. Use what you learned to address the short-term and long-term goals you had previously set. Transparency is key in your communication with stakeholders. It is actually about your credibility. This whole action plan must be credible. In step 3 and 4, I talked a little bit about principles of engagement, and some of this was really for in-person or one-off engagements. But this 5-step approach for stakeholder engagement overall is intended to be an ongoing process, and it has a feedback loop built in, which allows you to tackle strategic or systemic issues that are of high value to the company. Examples for ongoing engagement could include things like stakeholder panels or advisory boards or regular surveys that you conduct. And there are some key considerations here as well, which I'd like to highlight. If you consider ongoing engagement necessary for you to meet your goals, then it is very important that you anticipate and plan carefully, because this will influence your stakeholder identification and mapping, as well as the trajectory of the ongoing relationship. You must also develop a clear mandate. There are many reasons to bring stakeholders together on a regular basis, from providing strategic input to co-creating a new initiative. Just be very clear about it. And also, if you want to have an ongoing advisory function, the composition is very important. And you must allow for trade-offs in terms of breadth and depth on issues, as well as diversity. Then you see the term payment here. If you seek an ongoing commitment from stakeholders, financial compensation will quickly become a consideration. Now, there are some ethical considerations when it comes to this, so be very careful and very transparent when it comes to this point. Confidentiality and disclosure. Of course, there must be clear guidelines for this and the sharing of decisions and key discussion points. And anything you need to do must be done with the aim to be as effective as possible, thinking also, for example, of term limits for panelists. If you have regular participants, maybe after a certain period of time, you would like to change them up. So to foster evolution as well as a diversity of perspectives. To conclude, if you follow this 5-step approach, you can really build your own successful engagement strategy and develop a set of activities matching your key stakeholders' expectations. Just remember, you must keep your word. If you say you're going to keep stakeholders updated, do so. And you must manage expectations. Don't destroy trust that you've built by raising expectations that you cannot meet. Always keep the communication open. Don't pretend to want feedback, but then don't act on it. If you just want to gather information with an engagement, say so. With this, I will end my presentation and wish you all fruitful and constructive stakeholder engagements. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. Thank you for bringing a very practical perspective to the entire stakeholder engagement process. So we are now moving on to the fireside chat panel discussion. The panel will consist of both Andy and Stephanie, whose bios I have read to you earlier. So now please allow me to introduce our moderator for the panel, who is the Executive Director of BCSD Malaysia, Mr. Roberto Benatello. With over 20 years of experience, Roberto's career includes several senior general management positions with both Fortune 500 companies and startups in countries such as Italy, UK, and Spain. He was also the CEO of the EU Malaysia Chamber of Commerce, Eurocham. He is currently a member of the HRD Core Industry Expert Committee for Skill Area Sustainability and to the Industry Advisory Panel for the Center for Global Sustainability Studies. He is also an accredited HRD Core trainer. Our next speaker joining us for the panel is Ms. Lavanya Rama Iyer, who is the Head of Policy and Climate Change at the Worldwide Fund for Nature Malaysia, or WWF. She represents WWF on various national and international level engagements on climate change, biodiversity, and the UN Sustainable Development Goals. This includes sitting on various governmental steering committees and task forces. Ms. Lavanya led WWF in preparation of the joint report with the Boston Consulting Group entitled Securing Our Future: Net Zero Pathways for Malaysia, which was launched in Glasgow last year. She has contributed to the publication of various reports on climate change. In addition to this, she has coordinated the preparation of Malaysia's second report on climate change to the UN, worked at the UN in Geneva, and practiced law in Malaysia. Thank you so much for joining us, Ms. Lavanya. And now I would like to pass the floor to Mr. Roberto to start with the discussion. Thank you, and over to you, Roberto.
Thank you, Savita. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Andy. Thank you, Stephanie. You know, in line with our mission, we try to get to the how-to solutions. So hopefully we have provided some, practical tips, tricks, and troubleshooting. That's how I call it. And welcome, Lavanya. Thank you very much for being with us this afternoon. Your participation with us today is much appreciated, and especially your role and your expertise. I think it's absolutely important for this discussion. And I would like to start this discussion actually from you. And I would like to have you answer the first question, which is about giving some examples on how to develop strong professional relationships. So what are some of the strategies that you have used in your experience, in your professional experience so far, to develop strong professional relationships with stakeholders in your field, in the looking at the different industries and sectors you have worked with? So if you can start with that, and then we kick off the discussion.
Sure. Thank you so much, Roberto. Thank you, BCSD, for inviting me. Thank you, Savita, for the kind introduction earlier. And it was really excellent hearing now my fellow panelists earlier interventions on very practical approaches towards stakeholder engagements. So yes, as an NGO, we obviously have a wide array of stakeholders that we regularly have to engage with on issues that of relevance and importance for us to advocate on. And I think critical to our engagements is really to come across as a credible voice, right? And that credibility is something that is not, you can't just expect it. It has to be built. It has to be built by trust, and it has to be earned. And by that, I mean, what you say and what you advocate for should be very grounded. It should bear up to it should bear up to scrutiny. And I think so this is where it really ties in very much with what was said earlier with the 5 steps. First and foremost, as you approach any of your stakeholders, you must have that credibility behind you. So as WWF, we are a science-based organization. And so a lot of what we do is really built bottom up. We see what's happening in the area that we are experts in, if you'd like, in conservation, in nature. And from that, we sort of bring out the messages that we want to convey. Now, this also means that the communication has to be respectful. You must be open to understanding and accepting different points of views. So we might be convinced by what we see, what we hear, because this is what we do all the time. But that's not to say that people who disagree with us are just blatantly against us. It's because they may not have that level of understanding that we enjoy. And I always put myself in the shoes of trying to understand some kind of, say, financial argument for taking a particular decision. And I'm always scratching my head thinking, what, right? And I might disagree with it, but it's not because I want to be to oppose somebody. It's because maybe that's not my area of expertise, and I need someone to break it down to much more manageable bits of information. So in our experience, as we communicate what we want, and I suppose that the message that we try to communicate is a little outside your mainstream messaging, right? In order to do that, we do need to understand who our target audiences are and cater the messaging according to what would be understandable to them, right? So if you're working with the financial sector, for example, our messaging must relate to what they are normally engaged in, with the understandings of what financial risks, things that might come about to their business if what we see happening on the ground is not also incorporated as part of their business DNA. Likewise, if it's with communities, right? You cannot go to communities with all this huge, data or this, that, and the other 1.5 degree increase in temperature, and even, so much sea level rise may not make any sense to them, right? But you need to sort of engage at a different level. You still make the communication very transparent and provide it, build it on factual basis, but you make sure that it is tailored to what makes sense to them. So you could say that you used to have your paddy fields, or you used to have your shoreline, up to this, and your grandfather used to go out fishing and come back with so much, and today you see the shoreline has receded so much and your catch is so little. So that's how you start getting engagement, understanding towards a common outcome eventually. So I won't say it's the easiest of things to do, but it is a very effective and impactful thing, definitely to invest in, because ultimately what you are doing is paving the road, paving the path, and making that journey so much easier, because along the way you're bringing in your stakeholders, you're bringing in all the interested parties to be aligned to one view, and then the journey becomes easier because you won't have people wanting to generally act outside of what is expected. People will understand why it is meaningful. They become owners of whatever it is that you are trying to advocate. So maybe with those remarks, just sets the scene. I can share some examples later, but I just wanted to make those opening points. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Lavanya. So you started by talking about credibility, but another important factor is transparency. So to what extent does transparency matter in stakeholder engagement? Do all parties need to be aware of everything, or is there a certain amount of discretion that can be used in order to disclose information and to disclose intent? Is there a particular guideline to follow? What's your take on this?
Well, definitely, I think honesty, honesty, and you know those. I mean, being coming across as being sincere. These are the things that you should really adhere to. I mean, WWF, we have certain core values that we all subscribe to. You know, and these are the values that guide any of our engagements, either with our colleagues or externally. And you know, they are things that we are all familiar with, you know, being courageous, being respectful, having integrity. But all these things must come out in however we approach things, right? So when we talk about transparency, yeah, you know, uh, um, it's not necessary, I think, to sort of bear everything, bear all, right? Because sometimes that could be a disincentive, or I mean, it could actually push people away. Too much information also is not necessarily a good thing. Too much information can, in fact, result in stakeholder disengagement, right? So it really matters, and I think picking up on what was said earlier, it really matters that you do that proper stakeholder mapping and then come up with a communication strategy as to how you want to employ with the different stakeholders. So it's still about giving the right information, not using stakeholder engagement as an opportunity for rubber stamping, or just to tick off your box that, okay, yes, I've done it. That's insincere, and people will pick up on that quite quickly. But really being very genuine about what you're doing and making sure that you take the time to assess what it is you want out of this, who are the key stakeholders, and what how do you communicate with them so that they understand the issues at hand. And it's important to be honest also upfront if there are things that are going to negatively impact them.
Yeah.
I think that gives a lot of credibility again to you, because you're stating it up front. If you know it already, you're stating it up front and then saying, look, let's dialogue and see how we can overcome this. So yeah, so just one thing I would say, sometimes these kind of things actually give an opportunity for growth, opportunity for advancement. Yeah.
But from your point of observation at WWF, you must have seen, how companies in Malaysia approach their stakeholders. Quickly, tell me, what's your opinion? What are the main issues? What are the main problems that Malaysian companies encounter when they, communicate, talk with their stakeholders? What would you say the main issues are?
Maybe let me take a very specialized example, okay, which may not be so common, to the audience here, but it's still something very important. It is on biosafety. And part of our biosafety laws requires preparation of documents for public consultation. And these documents are put up online for people to review. I don't know whether the process has changed a lot over the years, and I hope it has. But at the time when I first looked at it, this was many years ago, and the documents are there, but when you read it, it's gobbledygook. It's not telling me anything. It's very full of technical, scientific jargon, and even sometimes shortcuts, which don't really, tell you anything. So that is not really public engagement, right? That is, it's it almost feels like you're trying to hide something. Okay, so it's to avoid things like that. I think actually, to be very honest, I think the corporate sector and even the government now are seeing stakeholder engagements as something necessary, because the problems we are facing today, climate change, biodiversity loss, these are existential crises, and no one body, no one authority, no one person can actually come up with all the the solutions to all the different angles that these problems are tackling. And it is incumbent that we all sit together, put our heads together, and only then will we come up with viable solutions. Maybe just to digress a little bit, we saw, how that didn't work in Copenhagen. So I don't know whether you'll remember Copenhagen 2009 climate conference failure. The Copenhagen Accord was a failure. Why? Because there was a group of countries that decided that they'd get together and they were going to decide what needed to happen. And they were going to sort of force it down the throats of all the other countries who were there. I mean, I was at the negotiations at that point, and clearly it didn't work. And it not only didn't work, it pushed back the agenda many years. That trust that had been built was then destroyed. And we had to then spend so much time rebuilding the trust before then you can come to sitting together and then trying to move forward with the issue, which then happened in Paris. And it continues to happen. I mean, it's continuously ongoing, right? So these are the things I think maybe corporates should also learn from. It's not that we are saying that all sensitive information and all should be disclosed, but there must be a certain level of engagement and understanding. I think someone mentioned earlier that it's no longer about stakeholder value, but shareholder value, but it's about stakeholder value. Yeah. And if you build yourself around that notion that you are serving not to build shareholder value only, but actually value to all the other people who are part of your space, your clients, yeah, your suppliers, your employees, right? And even the wider community, because ultimately, you have to look at things in a more holistic way. Then what you do and how you're impacting even, things like the environment and all start making sense in a real way, if you'd like, even from the bottom line perspective, from the profits perspective. Yeah.
Lavanya, a yes or no reply. Are stakeholders becoming savvier, more expert, more informed? For example, could the financial stakeholders, investors, in understanding sustainability related matters? Yes, no?
More yes than no. Yes, I mean,
yes
certainly
no.
the interest is definitely growing. Yeah, we see. Yeah. I mean, I'll just give one example. EPF, for example, big investor, yeah, have already made the announcement that all their investments will be ESG compliant by 2030. So yes, we do see that movement. Yep.
Andy, what do you think about this one? Are stakeholders becoming savvier, better in understanding ESG related risks and matters and opportunities as well?
I think if it's a yes no, I would go definitely more towards yes than no as well. But I think there's still work to do in raising awareness of stakeholders of how the actions that companies are taking towards progressing on the sort of sustainability agenda for sure.
Thank you very much, Andy, for tackling a very important, point of analysis of stakeholders from the perspective of materiality assessment within the context of reporting matters, which is something that is very dear to BCSD Malaysia. We're trying to launch this program. We've been trying to push and get some of our members to adopt and to get the reports analyzed. And I think it's a fantastic tool, and it provides a very good qualitative assessment of sustainability reports, especially something that has been already tried and tested by you guys for many years, and with hundreds and hundreds of reports. And we can actually give benchmark data by sector. So it's a very, very interesting approach that we really would like the business to adopt more in Malaysia. But what do you see are some of the practical challenges that companies are facing in engaging stakeholders, particularly related to the materiality? How might they overcome these challenges? What's your view on that?
Yeah, I've certainly got a few views on that. I think one thing maybe just on the reported matters piece, we've seen real genuine improvement in the quality of disclosure with the engagements that we've been able to do with our members, and I'm sure you're planning the same kind of approach with that sort of practical feedback. Has been really helpful, and it all comes down to the kind of the credible voice and honesty and transparency points that Lavanya was raising. That what goes out into the public domain is it's the voice of the company, and that really needs to be very carefully considered. And the reporting matters process helps with our members with that. So back to your question. That was a bit of a aside. So if I'm going to sort of answer this question from the disclosure lens, and I think clearly best practice in disclosure has to go beyond just stating we surveyed stakeholders or something similar to that. It needs to really go into that detail of how they're involved, how they're engaged, and some of maybe the quantitative inputs that they provided. And I think the steps that Stephanie provided are actually really helpful in thinking about how to construct that stakeholder engagement. So we did a piece of research in 2021 with Erasmus School of Economics, and we did a very deep dive and systematic analysis of about 400 sustainability reports, looking specifically at the materiality analysis. And there was a few things that came up which we thought were really interesting and kind of picked up on many of the sort of issues that both Lavanya and Stephanie kind of raised. And the first one was that obviously all companies have multiple stakeholders, but when you obviously engage with multiple stakeholders, who really decides whether a given topic is material for the organization? What is really material for one stakeholder? So it might be a community group. Clean water may be a really significant issue for a community group, but for a investor, that may not be a consideration at all. So how do you balance this need to take stakeholders' needs into account without running into that risk of that everything is kind of material to someone? So that's one of and I think some of the points that Stephanie brought up, how to prioritize the stakeholders with that sort of impact kind of influence type axis is one way to consider how you weight those opinions. The other point I thought was kind of that came out of our research was that considering stakeholder groups as a whole may actually be missing nuance between different within different stakeholder groups. So you can put investors as a big bucket and say, we considered the views of investors in our, but actually the needs of some investors, particularly those who are thinking about on a much more progressive, much more ESG type approach, how they're really looking for to understand the sustainability context in which the company is operating may be very different from those that are just looking for return on investment and considering the kind of the materiality concept as set out by the USSEC, for example. I think also the other interesting point is that one of the kind of challenges is, if you consult the same stakeholders all the time, you're kind of getting into like a selection bias where you kind of, if you need to look beyond the kind of user's perspective, the point that Stephanie also raised, and it's nice to see that some of our research maybe aligns. if you work with the same NGOs that maybe you're partnering on a particular initiative, that you might actually just be getting sort of echoing back from them what you're already talking about. So there's this kind of definitely a good opportunity to go beyond that kind of usual suspect. Think about how to select stakeholders who may be new or emerging, and certainly trying to engage with, refresh your stakeholder engagement process on a kind of a regular basis. And then I think there's a really sort of interesting fourth point that we observed was that determining who the information that you're putting into your materiality assessment, into your sustainability report, who that information is for, particularly when you start to think about there's moves particularly in Europe and in the US, and I'm sure many other regions are going to follow suit as a result of the work of IOSCO, that there'll be this sort of push towards mandatory external validation of ESG reports, and that actually when undertaking the assurance assignment, the auditor or assurance provider needs to consider the audience in the report in determining how effective the report is and if it's free from material misstatement. So if you're not clear on who your stakeholders are and why you're putting certain information in your report, you kind of run this risk of even having a really expensive assurance engagement, because the assurance provider has to do a lot of work to understand why you've included certain information, or you have a risk of not being able to obtain the assurance to the level that is required or will potentially be required as a result of future regulation. So those were kind of a few points, and I guess maybe just on some sort of practical reflections that certainly that considering the broad range of stakeholders outside the normal sphere of influence is something that that we've, through reported matters and other channels, is that we're encouraging a lot of our members to think about.
One thing that you just mentioned about assurance, tell me from, again, your point of observation, do you see more thorough assurance being used in reports? Just a quick comment on this trend, because that's quite interesting.
Yeah,
in my point of view.
Yeah, so obviously, there's basically two levels of assurance for level which is considered to the same level of robustness as financial information, which under the ISAE 3000 guidance issued by the ISSB, it's the same level of robustness as financial information. So that's called reasonable assurance. And then obviously there's a limited level of assurance, which basically says we don't think there's any material misstatement in this disclosure, but we're not giving a positive response. What we're seeing in WBCSD members is there's a progression towards from no assurance to a limited assurance of certain KPIs, most normally greenhouse gas emissions, through to then looking at getting that information reasonably assured, and then other indicators such as water use and waste, etc. They kind of follow on that sort of path. So there's a very slow trend towards reasonable assurance. But at the minute in our membership, there's something like, I think it's about 10% of companies have reasonable assurance, the rest have a limited assurance or no assurance at all. Okay, so the important thing is that there is an upward trend, even if it's very mild. But let's hope we can go towards that, because the quality of the data obviously is going to be much better. So, Stephanie, in the interest of time, do you mind if we go straight to some of the questions from the floor, and we try to answer them together? So Edmund Bond, how do we hi Edmund, how are you? Nice to see you here. How do we evaluate whether an engagement has been effective or not? Any metrics? Sometimes engagements happen, but feedback is not accounted for. So first thing, whoever wants to pick up the question, metrics on stakeholder engagement, anybody?
Yeah, I think I can try this. I mean, this is always the million-dollar question. How do I measure whether I have effectively engaged? And if you consider this whole process, and as we said, it's like a journey, it's an ongoing iterative process. It's about building a relationship, about understanding your stakeholder concerns, and about building trust and credibility. So I believe over time, you will have more visibility on how effective it is. You have to also start planning it from the start with very clear objectives for each engagement. And then, of course, you can use things. There is tools like engagement assessment metrics, but I think you still have to understand that this kind of engagement doesn't always have tangible ROIs. I can just add here, for example, if you manage through building very positive ongoing relationships where you establish that you are an organization that is transparent and credible and trying its best, if you establish that relationship, then you may be able to avoid negative impact of an issue on your company just because your stakeholders will trust you. As we said, as I said in one of my slides, it's like a savings. Yeah, you build the credibility and they believe that you are always trying to act in the best interest and to do what's right and to also seek information. Yes, you will make mistakes, but you are learning. If you already portray this in a credible manner, I think Lavanya said it very clearly, it's about authenticity, about honesty. So if you engage in these relationships, the longer you do this and the more transparent you are about it, I think the more credit you build. So you might, and again, how do you measure the avoidance of a negative impact? But you just know that if you hadn't had that relationship, things could have become more critical. There could have been even a boycott of your organization or things like that.
Thank you, Stephanie. Anybody else who wants to comment on the metrics? Yes, please, Lavanya.
Yeah, just Edmund, that therefore if you engage with certain stakeholders, for example indigenous communities, there is this free prior informed consent that needs to be obtained, and there are guidelines on what you need to undertake to obtain that kind of consent before sort of doing something that might affect them. Yeah. There are certain specific frameworks that can be applied in specific context. Even as an organization like WWF, when we do conservation work, we also have a framework called Environmental and Social Safeguards Framework, which we have to undertake, engage and speak to the people around in that communities and so on, to make sure that we are not doing anything inadvertently that might go against, their rights or beliefs. And likewise, we understand what they are and then work together to come up with something meaningful. Yep.
There's a question, very sorry, Andy, did you want to comment on this one? On the metrics?
No. Okay.
No, okay. There is a question from Anga Jiaxin, Top Glove. Very specific, sometimes talking to stakeholders involves surveys, and sometimes we survey thousands and thousands of stakeholders when it comes to customers, for example. Well, in your point of view, Andy, for example, some of the data that you have seen in some of the reports, what's the percentage of a response rate which is considered acceptable from a survey that goes to stakeholders? Any kind of indication that you have there?
Yeah, that's a really difficult one. And I think I think if
how
you're
long
going
is a
to
piece of
ask,
string? Yeah.
I think if you're going to ask, from an academic kind of research perspective, you need a big enough sample size to be able to say that it's representative of your audience. So if you survey 100 people and maybe only 5 respond, you wouldn't say that's representative of your audience. But if you survey 3,000 people and you get a 30% response rate, you can probably say that's representative of the views of your customers, for example. So yeah, it's a very difficult one to answer. But I think typically what we see in some of the reports that we've looked at is that, you know, in surveys and things like that, if you're getting to 40% response rates from stakeholders, particularly customers, you'd expect more from maybe stakeholders that you're much closer to in terms of partners, suppliers, etc. But maybe 40% response rate from 34% from customers would be something that would maybe be aligned with expectations.
There's another question from one Ahmed. For stakeholder engagement, is there any ideal duration before we review its effectiveness and renew the engagement? So I think basically the question is, you know, how often do we need to renew the engagement, and what sort of criteria do we use to, you know, understand the frequency of the engagement, and is it worth going back to the same stakeholder group, and how often do we need to do that? Anybody? I think it's one. Yeah, go ahead, Stephanie.
Sorry.
Or Lavanya.
I think Lavanya wants to speak first. Like I
Stephanie,
add on. Yeah, I guess some of these points are they are very critical, but I think that's where you have to group your stakeholders first and sort out beforehand how you want to engage with each of those groups and for what reasons. And then if you decide that your key stakeholder groups, to go into an ongoing long-term engagement, then I think it becomes a process where if you document the engagement and you think about, you know, all the points that were brought up in the discussion, how did you address them, which ones were not addressed, then it will automatically generate a process which will tell you that you still need to engage further. You will always know what you need to do for the next round. Now, the frequency depends on many factors. It depends on on the urgency of the issue. It depends on the capacity that you have, but also of the capacity of your stakeholder. And I think you just have to come to an agreement that makes sense in relation to those criteria.
I just add, yeah, I think it's a very iterative process, and you have to manage expectations. I think that point was already made earlier by either Stephanie or Andy, but you have to manage expectations so that, you know, if it's a very key stakeholder and you're saying, okay, I'm going to come back to you with what we are going to present to get your buy-in subsequently, you must respect that and do it. But again, so, you know, at the end of a stakeholder engagement, you should outline what the next steps are, you know, what your way forward would be following. Yeah.
Thank you, Lavanya. So we've come to the end, but there is a question that I would like to, and apologies for not having answered all the questions, but this question, I think it fits as the last question, because it's a topic that I consider personally extremely important. In terms of sustainability reporting and report, how do you identify greenwashing pitfalls? So greenwashing in the context of sustainability reporting, and why not stakeholder engagement? Just a couple of words to conclude from all our panelists.
I'm happy to take a first stab at that. I think, you know, one of the things really important is balance in the in whatever you put into the public domain. That including examples of things that haven't gone well as the things that have will give much more credibility than just presenting the stuff that, you know, that your success is, because we know, like everyone knows in business, things don't always go well, and although we're all striving to do our best in terms of, you know, meeting sustainability targets, for example, it doesn't always go well. So I think my main thing would be balanced. Say, explain when things don't go well and be transparent about it.
Yeah. Stephanie, Lavanya.
Okay, I mean, for me, being in a communications consulting role and working with a lot of organizations, I do sometimes come across the idea that we should just present something as already resolved and to turn it into a PR campaign. That always backfires, because it has to be a genuine effort. So I think the the answer to how to avoid being seen as greenwashing is make sure that you only communicate once you have undergone a real engagement process. And you can tell by looking at who is involved in the process and is it actually a regular engagement. And then obviously the disclosure, you have to be able to show what you have done. I think that's the only thing. I have to say that greenwashing is often used very freely. So it's also, if you look at social media, there is this skepticism. Often people will say, oh, this is just greenwashing. But if you are ready to show what you have done, then I think you can avoid that.
Lavanya, last comment from you.
Thank you, Roberto. Yeah, just to add, I think what maybe people need to look at is presenting the impact that they are striving for. So be impact driven rather than profit driven ultimately. And then I think things will fall in place. So at the moment, you know, if the measure of how successful you are is still going to be your conventional profits approach, there is always going to be that risk of that greenwashing happening, yeah, because it's still going to be serving the profits goal, which, you know, but if you're really genuine about it, you shift into becoming an impact-driven body, organization, you know, that will speak for itself. Your profits will still be there, but the impact will also, you know, emerge and be genuine. Yeah. So, I mean, that's kind of where I might want to leave it. Thanks.
Definitely. Thank you very much. So, ladies and gentlemen, this is all we have time for this afternoon, and I hope you have enjoyed the session as much as I have. It was a real pleasure to talk to this distinguished panel. So, thank you very much, Lavanya, Andy, Stephanie, for your presentations, for your contribution. By the way, there is a lot of interest in stakeholder engagement and how to do that properly. And I would like to take this opportunity to announce that within the BCSD Academy, we are now working in turning this short seminar webinar into a proper training module, which will be launched in the coming months, and will go into our catalog menu of training modules that we already have within the BCSD Academy. So thank you very much, everybody, and over to you, Savita.
Thank you so much, Roberto, and thank you so much to the panelists for their time and expertise. We are very grateful to have you with us. And to the attendees, thank you for joining, and we really hope that you enjoyed and learned from this discussion. Please feel free to follow us on LinkedIn. The link is in the chat box for any upcoming events. And well, that's all from me. Thank you, and till next time, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.